Hey everybody, I'm Jesse Lee, Online Programs Director here at the White House. Thanks again for joining us. Always happy to work with Ustream. We'll keep an eye on the chat in here to take your questions. I'm here with Austan Goolsbee. We're talking about Wall Street reform. The president gave a major speech in New York City just yesterday, and took some questions in advance off of Facebook also. So leave your questions in the chat. We'll get to some of the questions before. And Austan, you want to say just a couple words on the speech yesterday?
Well, the president went back to Cooper Union in New York, where he was more than 2 years ago, before Lehman failed, before the big crisis began, and he unfortunately had to be delivering the same message, which was we really, really need to reform the regulatory system that supervises our financial institutions. Back then, he was saying we need to do this so that we don't have a big financial crisis. We had that financial crisis, and now the time has come to bring this thing into the hangar and be done with it. The president outlined several key aspects. I'm sure people may ask about some of them, but essentially it's let's end the system of bailouts. Let's protect consumers. Let's get derivatives out of the dark and out into the open. Let's limit the risky activities that banks can take. And let's get to a situation which is better for financial institutions themselves and for the economy in the long run, which is we got strong oversight laying out rules of the road, and we grow from there. So I think everybody's pretty hopeful that we're going to get a regulatory reform, that we're going to do that in a bipartisan way, because I think, maybe not the leadership, but ordinary members of Congress, I think they're going to look at the bill. They're going to say, this is exactly what we need. The financial institutions ought to pay to clean up their mess, not the American people.
All right. We'll start with something we got off Facebook earlier. It was from Katie Reeves. What steps would be taken to prevent Wall Street from creating products like CDOs that regulators and other people do not even understand?
Well, this is what Katie's raising here is one of the things that went dreadfully wrong and caused this financial crisis. We had a massive proliferation of super complex instruments, and these CDOs, most of the worst ones, were based on subprime or Alt-A or other mortgages. And so I'd say there are at least 3 steps in the chain to prevent stuff like that from blowing up. The first is you establish the most robust, most comprehensive consumer protection for financial products that we have ever had in this country. So you would have cleaned up the first layer of mortgages, and they would not have been able to engage in some of the practices that they were engaged in that put the mortgages at risk. Second, in this bill, for securitizations, which are things like these instruments are based on, the creator of the security would have to retain some ownership. So what happened in this crisis is people would generate these things based on, say, mortgages that they knew were going to fail, but they would just sell them off. They got paid right off the bat, and then they couldn't care less whether they were going to default or not. We have to get away from that model, so the people who create it got to retain some ownership so that they've got the quote-unquote skin in the game and have an incentive to make sure that the right people are getting the money. And then the third is that there's a layer of the regulator looking at the institutions and looking at what banks are allowed to do in the course of what's called the Volcker Rule, which would make sure that companies had enough money on their balance sheets so that if something goes wrong, they've got the capital there to back themselves up, and that there are certain kinds of risky things that they would be doing that they wouldn't be allowed to do. So I think with a series of steps would help us prevent some of that stuff from blowing up.
All right. And one of the reasons I like doing it with Austan here is he's a tough guy, and he could take questions like this from Brett Holbert earlier. Why are you trying to expand the stranglehold this oppressive regime has on this country and on business?
Well, thank you for your comments, Brett, and thank you for taking the time to listen to our questions. Obviously, we're going to have a little bit of a disagreement if, and I know Brett there are a lot of people who think that way. I don't see how you can look at the last 8 years, and even before that, the massive ripping up the rules of the road that took place, which directly led to the financial crisis, and say, well, we really ought to stick with the status quo or loosen up the rules of the road even more, that somehow they had a stranglehold on the financial system. To me, that's almost the opposite of what happened. They stopped minding the store and the carjackings began. You got to have rules of the road. You got to make sure that we have free and fair competition. Now, nobody, and the president made clear that he does not believe that we in any way should have the government running the financial system. The only way we got into this situation, that we had to bail out some of these people, and the bailouts which began under the last administration exist only because the system failed completely. That's why we need a new system. It doesn't hurt, as I said at the outset, and as the president said in New York. It doesn't hurt the free market. It doesn't undermine your belief in capital markets or private business that you have sensible oversight of the financial system. In fact, it's completely vital that you have it. The thing that undermined the private sector more than anything else was that the public completely lost trust in financial markets and pulled all their money out. That's what led to the financial crisis. So, I appreciate Brett's comments, but I think he's off base on that one.
Right. Yeah, not to overstep my moderator role here, but an analogy that occurred to me the other day was when you looked at baseball and the whole steroids controversy. When there were loopholes in the rules and the testing and everything, you had a situation where some players were using it and the other players felt like they had to do it just to compete. And that's not a good situation for even the players themselves.
That's not good for the players, and you saw a similar dynamic in this boom time where the folks that were cutting the corners the most, they were making great money because gaming the system was extremely profitable if nobody's enforcing the rules. And in a world like that, you're punishing the people for playing by the rules because they got to compete against people who aren't. So without setting the rules of the road, you're gonna be on a path for problems.
All right. One question we got from Lisa Fisher in the chat, and maybe you can give some context on what she's talking about here too, because it's been a big debate, is what other options exist for funding the $50 billion wind-down fund if it is removed because of legislative compromise?
Okay, this is a key point. For anybody who hadn't been following this in detail, this legislation that's winding through Congress that they're going to vote on has had a pre-funded $50 billion fund. Now, that fund was a bipartisan idea that Republicans and Democrats had come up with expressly so that taxpayers